Hello friends, the Bourbon Nerd here. Welcome to lesson 11 in my bourbon school. So today we're going to talk about Angel's Share that you may have heard about, and then its lesser known cousin Devil's Cut. They are closely related, as you'll see in a second here. And to help me through this episode, I am sipping on actually a fairly new whiskey. So this is from Smooth Ambler. It's their Founders Cask Strength series. This is batch 2 that I picked up last week at the distillery, actually. It's really, really nice. So cheers, y'all. Right. So Angel's Share and Devil's Cut. So they are indeed cousins because there are certain properties that are so similar between them. So they're both responsible for minimizing and lowering the amount of whiskey available to you. So that's not very good, of course. But they're also sort of both a curse and a blessing in the same time. And as you will see when I go through this lesson here, you could take the curse perspective, but you could definitely also take the blessing perspective. But let's go into both of them in detail, and I'll explain to you what they are. All right. First up, of course, Angel's Share that you may have heard about. So the definition here is simply the amount of whiskey that sort of evaporates from the barrel during the maturation or the aging. So if you fill up a barrel completely, with 53 gallons, like most American whiskey barrels, after a couple of years, there'll be less than 53 gallons of whiskey left due to evaporation, and that is referred to as the Angel's Share. And how much do you think actually evaporates during this time? It's actually a little bit more than you would think, because in the first year, it's about 10%, so 5 gallons, right? Which is quite dramatic. And I'll explain to you a little bit later in the lesson why the first year has higher evaporation than the following years, because in each following year, approximately 4% of the content in the barrel evaporates, and it continues and continues. Some indicate that it goes to 3%, but on sort of an average, it's going to be about 4%. And I would say the hotter the climate, as you could maybe expect, the higher the evaporation here. But it also varies a little bit depending on the warehouse types that you use. Okay. So if you look at it by the numbers, it's actually quite dramatic here. So you can see here, I have a little table here that explains to you how much whiskey is actually left after a certain number of years here. So you obviously start with a 53, and you can see, as I told you, the first year already 5 gallons, so approximately 10% of the content is gone. And if you continue down this list here, you can see after actually 18 years, just an example, you're down to 24 gallons, so less than half of what you started with. So this Angel's Share evaporation is very, very dramatic. Less than half after 18 years. And you can imagine if you store it even further, it goes down even further, and to the point where there's almost no whiskey left in the barrel. And if you think here, but hang on, I know that Scotch whiskey, for instance, there are products that you age for 40 years, 50 years, and 60 years. Yeah, I know, but they are also sort of maturation or maturing the barrels in a much colder climate, which means that there will not be as much evaporation. And there are a few other reasons that I'll get back to in another lesson as well. All right. If you want to represent this table a bit visually, maybe it's easier for you to see. You can actually see here sort of an indication of a full barrel. And if you go through this, 1, 4, 12, and 18 years, you'll actually see how dramatic it is. The color also changes, as you'll also see on the next slide here, of course, because it takes up all the color from the charring, as we discussed in previous lessons, and also, of course, all the nice wood sugars also give a little bit of color to that. And if you want to look at how it actually would look the whiskey, the color here, I have found this picture here, and that actually shows you what the evaporation, so the Angel's Share, and also the color changes, or in this case, about 15 years. So each bottle here, the change, if you go from left to right, is about 6 months. So every half year, you'll see there's a little bit of change in the color, and there's also some change in the level in the whiskey bottle itself. So this is actually a good picture of sort of indicating both the color changes and also the evaporation over the years. So quite interesting. All right, but why is there so much evaporation? It is a little bit surprising, right? So I found these three sort of reasons, the main reasons I think here. So firstly, of course, natural evaporation always appears. You know, it is an oak barrel after all. You know, there's alcohol in there. It's liquid. It's trying to evaporate. It always happens. You know, even though oak is very, very dense, as we discussed in previous lessons, there will also be a little bit of openings, you know, when the staves are connected, where the liquid can escape. But also, as I explained before, so that first year where there's 10% of angel share, the reality is that some of that angel share is not only evaporation, it's also the sort of the wood itself, if that makes sense, that absorbs the whiskey. And that's why there's so much evaporation the first year. So 10%, right? So that is one of the reasons. And then, of course, there is this other thing that we taught about in lesson 7. You may recall it, and if you haven't seen lesson 7, don't worry about. I'll do a quick repeat here. I don't know if you remember this picture, if you saw the lesson, but there's this is actually a stave, you know, cut through, and you can see there's sort of like the soak line there. That is actually where the staves are connected, and the whiskey is obviously trying to penetrate those openings. And you can see it's done a pretty good job here. It's almost, what, 2/3 in, and it actually goes all the way through a little bit depending on the climate here. So the whiskey, as we discussed in previous lesson, you know, when it gets hot during the summer, you know, the liquid expands, obviously, because liquid always expands when it gets hot, and then it's trying to penetrate the wood all it can do, and that's one of the primary reasons why we have angels here, about 4% every year, except for the first year, which is about 10%. All right. And then there's this thing about the name. And you know, no one really knows who came up with the name, but yes, you can imagine, you know, all these whiskey vapors that go up to the skies, and people think, you know, then the angels get their little share of the action there. So that's why they call it angel share, but no one really knows who came up with the name. So that's angel shares for you. So that's basically the evaporation from a barrel over the years. All right. So one thing I wanted to talk to you about regarding angels here is that except for the angels, are there other beneficiaries from this evaporation? And it turns out there actually is, because I want to introduce you to a friend here that has a serious alcohol problem. It's actually a fungus called Bedonia comanensis. It's also sometimes known as the whiskey fungus or the angel share fungus, which actually makes sense. And it is a fungus that sort of lifts off the alcohol vapors from the distillery or the warehouse. And see here, there's a picture here. I took that many years ago from Heaven Hill Distillery because it's so predominant here. You see all the black stuff there? That's actually the fungus. And you know, when I saw this the first time, I actually didn't know about this. You know, I had the immediate reaction. I mean, dude, couldn't you at least, you know, clean up the warehouse when you're there, like tourists coming and visit you? But it turns out if they do that, you know, wait a couple of more months and it's all back. So it's really, you know, why bother? And also, it's a completely benign fungus. You know, it doesn't hurt anyone. It just sits there and get its piece of the action as well. So it's called Bedonia comanensis, but some also call it the whiskey fungus. But that's where, so if you come across a distillery, especially the warehouses, obviously, and also the neighboring buildings, and you see this black stuff here, it's not because they haven't paid their cleaners, it's simply because it's just there and it's enjoying the alcohol. All right. Cool. So in conclusion regarding angel share, so I promised, you know, in the opening there, is it a cursing or a blessing? Curse or blessing, you know. So if you look at it from a curse perspective, of course it is a curse that it continuously reduces the amount of whiskey available to you. That's not good, right? Because, you know, you have less whiskey and it costs more, etc. So that's a bit of a curse from a distillery perspective. But if you look at it from sort of the blessing perspective, as we discussed in the previous lessons, the whiskey simply becomes more intense and also better, and also the proof level increases, which most of us like. And I put a little asterisk on there because it's not in all cases that the alcohol percentage does increase. And I have an upcoming lesson, by the way, on this topic of alcohol changes during the maturation period, which is very, very fascinating. So if I had to choose between the two, I would definitely say a blessing. Because yeah, I know less whiskey, but you can just make more whiskey in the beginning. But the whiskey that results from this Angel's Share, the intensification, just produce better whiskey. So I would say definitely a blessing there. All right. Well, then onto the cousin here. So Devil's Cut. If you haven't heard about it, don't worry. It's definitely the lesser known cousin of the two. And the definition again, that actually refers to not the evaporation, but the amount of whiskey trapped, if you will, inside the barrel itself in the oak. All the wood that have soaked up the whiskey during the maturation process. And as I just mentioned, especially in the first year, it sucks up a lot of whiskey. So all that whiskey, even though you emptied, or they call it dumping the barrel, there's still whiskey inside the wood. And that amount of whiskey inside the wood after it's been emptied is referred to as the Devil's Cut. If you think about, how much seriously can really be trapped inside the wood? I mean, maybe a little bit, right? You would actually be surprised because it can be up to 2 gallons in there. And just to put this into perspective, how much 2 gallons is, I'll put up a picture here and you would immediately think, hang on, I mean, I haven't done my math right. Yeah, so I know here I have 16 bottles of, in this case, Jim Beam White Label. It's 80 proof. And that actually is the same as 2 gallons of cask strength whiskey. So I do appreciate that 2 gallons is less than 16 bottles of whiskey. But if you sort of cut it down with water from, let's say, 130 ABV to 80 ABV, that actually turns into 16 bottles. So it's significant amount of whiskey that is still trapped inside the barrel. And that's called Devil's Cut, right? So on topic of Jim Beam, as you can see here, Jim Beam actually has a product called Devil's Cut. You can try it out if you want. And you can see here the picture next to me where I sort of had like a barrel that has been squeezed. Obviously, you cannot do that. It's from a commercial from Jim Beam. So they came up with this proprietary method where they're sort of adding a little bit of water and then they're sort of centrifuging or something. They're not really transparent about what they do, trying to extract that Devil's Cut from the whiskey itself, and then from the barrel itself, and then they are sort of mixing that Devil's Cut with normal whiskey, for instance, the Jim Beam White Label, and then they are selling this as the Devil's Cut. So I actually tried this product. It's pretty good. I mean, it's obviously a little bit more oaky, which is no surprise, given that it is Devil Cut in there. But they did not invent this name, but they sort of they commercialized the name Devil's Cut. So you can maybe try that out. It's actually an inexpensive and fun bottle to try out. All right. And if we want to do the same as we did before on Angel's Share, discuss whether this is really a curse or a blessing. This one is a little tougher, I think, to make a decision on. So if you look at it from a curse perspective, it's the same thing with Angel's Share. It sort of takes away the amount of whiskey available to you because it traps the whiskey inside the barrel itself. So that's a bit of a curse, of course, right? But the blessing, and you may not realize this, is that the blessing is that those freshly dumped or emptied barrels used for bourbon or rye whiskey, they're in so high demand around the world. You can imagine that you empty a bourbon barrel and then you ship it to Scotland. And just imagine there are almost 2 gallons worth of bourbon still in the barrel. Obviously a little bit of evaporation during the transportation. And then you add Scotch whiskey to it, and then it gets this nice, mellow, vanilla, caramel character to the Scotch whiskey. And they're pretty transparent about it. I mean, if you buy Scotch whiskey, many will say, aged in or matured in a first fill. That's what they call it, first fill bourbon barrel. They refer to the first fill as they were the ones that filled it for the first time after it had been used for bourbon, right? So that's why those empty barrels are in very, very high demand around the world. So that obviously gives the distilleries a lot of money for their used barrels. So that's good. So if I should choose between curse and a blessing, it's very, very close, but I would actually choose blessing because it gives the distilleries more money for their empty barrels. It also, I think, makes whiskey around the world better because it's being stored in used bourbon and rye barrels. And it also gives bourbon a good name, bourbon and rye good name, especially bourbon a good name because many Scotch drinkers are sort of used to having whiskey that has been stored in bourbon barrels. So comparing the two, I would definitely go for the blessing, even though it is a little bit closer run compared to the English year. All right, and that was basically it. So lesson 11, English year and Devil's Cut. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. If you like it, tell a friend. And if nothing else, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. It helps me a lot. I get higher in the Google search results. So with that, cheers. Thank you for listening.